I'm always happy when I get the opportunity to talk about some legal stuff. Just give me a second. Because there are some important legal instruments out there that really have an impact on your decisions. Now, today, talking about e-payments and how you can optimize your strategy, did you know that there is a law instrument out there that really impacts your decision? And this is called the E-Payment Service Directive number 2, the PSD2, the so-called PSD2. So it has very interesting stuff to tell you about how to decide for your e-payments method. And one thing that you have to take under consideration and is regulated in the PSD2 is what do you do about fraud cases and what is your liability in these kind of cases and what you should do to prevent fraud and enhance security. The other issue that the PSD2 comes to tell you in order to affect your decisions in the e-payment and in your general structure of electronic payments is your online sales structure. And this has to do mainly with marketplaces, which I will talk later on. It is interesting noting that there are so many fraud cases have been reported. This is a report, very newly reported, came actually this week. It's a global report about the fraud cases. If you see in Europe, the 3% of the e-commerce revenue is being lost in fraud. And if you see nearly the 3%, 2.5, 2.7, if I'm not wrong, of the cases are fraudulent cases. In Greece, from the report that we have, the recent report we have from the European Banking Authority, 0.03% of card transactions have been fraudulent transactions, and at least a value of 12 millions has lost in the fraud cases. So what happened with the chargebacks, and something that you need to know? We put a rule up there. It is up to the payment service provider and at the end of the day, the merchant to prove that he is not liable for a fraudulent case. So in order to be avail of any liability, in order to avoid liability, the payment service provider as well as the merchant, they have to prove in a chargeback case that the payment transaction was authenticated, that the authentication of the payment transaction has been accurately recorded and has not been affected by any technical breakdown or any technical elements of the PSP or the merchant. And if the merchant can prove that it's a first-party misuse, I mean, it's the cardholder and the payer that has acted fraudulently, then in all cases, merchants are being liable. They cannot prove that they are not, this is not a fraud case, that they are not liable for that. So what does this mean? It means that all merchants should take all technical steps and all legal steps to ensure that the payment service providers they are working with, they can enhance security as to this. So when a cardholder, when a customer has a dispute, it has to go to the bank. It cannot come directly to the e-shops. So the whole mechanism of the chargeback is they go to the bank. They have 13 months from the day the transaction has been made. So as soon as they find it out, they have to go to the bank, and then the bank can revert back into the payment chain and comes to the merchant to ask for some details. So it is, again, up to you to prove that you are not liable for this fraud case. And this is very important when it has to do with your cooperation with the payment service provider. So what we have here, the PSD2 came and said, we'll shift the liability if you enhance security, merchant, by adopting strong customer authentication mechanisms, then you are not liable for that because you can prove, you can take all the precautions to prove that the payer is the person who is linked to the payment instrument that has been used on your online venture. So what strong customer authentication is a multi-factor authentication with that what you need to do is to use at least 2 of these. It's an extra layer that you have to adopt in your e-commerce on the customer's journey in your e-commerce, in your e-shop, that they have to put credentials combining two authenticated elements. It is something that you have, a mobile phone, for example, something that you are, something that is inherent to you, like the biometric data, eye blinking, face recognition, or something that you know, which can be a password, which can be a PIN number. So all that it means is that you have to take extra technical steps to ensure that there is this mechanism of authentication, that you have to authenticate your customer that is linked with the payment instrument he's using in your e-commerce. But not all of this two-factor authentication will suffice under the spectrum of PSD2. We shouldn't confuse the strong customer authentication with any two-factor authentication that is out there in the market. Even in LinkedIn or Slack, you can find a two-factor authentication that above to your credentials, the username and password, you just add another one. It's not as simple as it sounds, and you shouldn't confuse that with a two-factor authentication, because the European Banking Authority, which is the supervisory body for the regulation, and they issue opinions, they have very specific standards when it has to do with a strong customer authentication. So it says what it does, well, it gives them the guidelines so we can infer what could and what could not suffice as a strong customer authentication. Like, for example, if the authentication is to happen like saying, give me the credentials that you have in the application installed in a device, this cannot suffice as something that we are possessing. Or if the extra layer for the strong customer authentication asks for the numbers that you have in the card, the printed numbers, then this does not suffice as something that you know. Same as the email address. So this is a big challenge for you to see which are those mechanisms you have to use, the two-factor elements subject to those technical specifications, in order to enhance your security and then prove that you are not liable because you have definitely authenticated the payer with a payment instrument that he has used in your e-shop. So strong customer authentication is required in all transactions initiated by the payer, by the customer. We will see in a bit there are some transactions that they are not considered that they have been initiated by the payer. So classical example of a payer-initiated transaction is when a customer comes into your shop and he buys stuff, so he initiates the payment for the sale of the goods. And it is applicable to all payment methods. Although now the most common payment method is this one used by cards, and the most fraudulent cases are related to the cards. However, the strong customer authentication is applicable to e-wallets as well. So when you're looking for alternative methods of e-payments, you have to make sure that these alternative payment methods do have the strong customer authentication. But then it's a big question and it's a big challenge for the payment service providers to take the test whether they need to have the strong customer authentication or not. But at the end of the day, as I said, because the liability is on you, you have to take all those measures to ensure that the payment service providers you are using for any kind of payment method do comply with PSD2 and strong customer authentication if that is the case. And strong customer authentication is across channels. Whether it's in your physical shop or your online shop, strong customer authentication should be there. But although PSD2 with a strong customer authentication has shifted the liability from you to the banks and the issuers and the payment service providers, however, most of the shops believe that that will cause consumer friction, extra layers, delays, abandoned charge, low experience for their users, and could be the case. But you have to check now if For any kind of transactions, you have to adopt the strong customer authentications. There are some cases that strong customer authentication is not required. And those are, for example, those that they are initiated by the merchant. For example, when you buy, a customer buys a product from your store, and then he has arranged to pay in installments, then this he has the strong customer authentication only for the first setup, and then for every installment, it is assumed that it's the merchant that initiates the payment, so you don't need for every installment to apply the strong customer authentication. Or the same happens when you have recurring billings, either with the same amount or with a different amount. So these are not covered by strong customer authentication. Mail order and telephone order, the well-known mottos, they are not considered kind of e-payment transactions, so you are not liable to have the strong customer authentication. You should be careful, though, with the digital assistants like the chatbots. If they initiate payments through chatbots, then this is subject to customer authentication. Strong customer authentication also is applicable when both the merchant and the customer are in the European Union. And in consequence, the issuer and the acquirer, which are the banks of the customer and the ESOP respectively. So if any of the two is outside the Europe, then the strong customer authentication is not a requirement. However, it should take best efforts, the merchant should take best efforts to adopt strong customer authentication. And there are some exceptions as well. It has to do with a low-value payment. If a transaction of a payment is lower than 30 euros, strong customer authentication could not be applicable. You can exempt the strong customer authentication mechanism. The same as some low-risk transactions. These are some transactions that are based on the fraud reports that the payment service providers have reported to the regulators. Like, for example, if the payment service provider has, if I remember correctly, something kind of 0.06% of fraud cases for amounts between 100 euros and 250 euros, then this is a rate that is considered low transaction. However, low transaction assessments are only they are happening only from the banks, the acquirer and the issuer. It's not up to the merchant to decide what the low-risk cases are. However, in conjunction with their acquirer and your payment service provider, you can find those and identify those kind of low-risk transactions if you want to exempt them from the strong customer authentication. Another exemption is the trusted beneficiary. It's only for the issuers to maintain a list, like the issuer of the payment instrument has a list into which the customer can go and add his your ESOP as a beneficial trusted owner. Upon some requirements, you can be exempted from strong customer authentication as well. And the same exemptions can be in the business-to-business. The B2B transactions are also exempted for the strong customer authentication because there are other KYC requirements that had been taken at first place. Sorry. Okay, sorry. These are the challenges. More steps, more chances for customer to drop out. It's a question that you have to ask yourselves. As I said, on the one hand, we should enhance security and be compliant and to avoid liability, but these extra layers and extra methods may cause this frustration. So it's up to you to decide how you shall keep the balance. What you have to do, you have to go and see how strong customer authentication impacts your transaction portfolio. Go and check your transactions portfolio. Is there any of them lies under the exemption or the non-requirement test? And see how many of your transactions can be exempted from the strong customer authentication. You have to go through a due diligence to your payment service providers and their systems. As I said, at the end of the day, the chargebacks, it's the merchants that they have at the end of the day to return the payment amount. So it's up to you to find all those mechanisms that you go through due diligence with your payment service providers and see if they are having the strong customer authentication. And see if all these are depicted in the contracts. Maybe you will see, I've seen most of the contracts with the payment service providers, although they have the strong customer authentication mechanism, they still shift the liability to the merchants because shift the liability to the merchant, so the merchant has to take all those measures to ensure that the payment service providers' measures are the correct ones that will avail them from liability. So be careful with the contracts that you have with your payment service providers. And also you have to see how you can handle the dispute mechanism. When a requirement comes from the bank to your payment service provider and back to you and asking for details, the card details and the transaction details, do you have those data? Do you have those data legally in order to provide them back to the bank? Or will the customer come and ask, how did you get access to my personal data, whereas it was the service provider that should have access to those data? So the GDPR steps in and has to regulate the whole system of the transaction. The second chapter has to do with marketplaces, and this should take this as a take-leave tip. PSD2, what come to say, it says if you are a marketplace, if you are a platform, and you are an intermediary between a customer and an e-shop, an online vendor, you have to take under consideration what PSD2 has to say. The order, in this kind of mechanism, the client, the customer orders into the platform, and then the platform sends the order to the retailer. So it's the retailer who makes the sale to the customer and not the platform. In this case, PSD2 comes and poses a big question to the marketplaces. It says, if the marketplaces receive, which is the most common case, if a marketplace receives payments and then proceeds to deposit the funds to the merchant while keeping its commission, this could be considered as a regulated service and it might need license. So you cannot, if you are a marketplace, you cannot hold funds on behalf of a merchant, but instead you have to find the mechanism that the merchant is getting paid directly from the consumer and you get your commissions. Otherwise, you need a license. So in this case, you need a payment institution. You have to put in your acquisition there, in your e-payment strategy. You need a payment institution behind you that has the license, which operates the split payments. So when the customer puts the order and the payment into the platform, then this goes into a kind of escrow account that the platform has into a payment institution, a licensed payment institution, which initiates payment and splits the payment and gives the payment to the retailer and sends the commission to the platform. And this case is, if you are in any of this, if you're in this case, you have to imagine how complicated that could be in the digital ecosystem when a platform is the merchant of the platform. When we have platform-to-platform commerce, then things getting very, very difficult to operate with the PSD2, with this payment institution and the split payments. So, e-payments should be part of your canvas of the strategy. There are low elements, very important, that you have to take under consideration and assess for your e-payment strategy. Legal issues do not come at the end after, do not come when you have the contract with the merchant and you have made all the technical stuff. It doesn't come to the end. It comes to the point that you take your strategic decisions as to the payment methods. But then again, as we said, with the PSD2 and the strong customer authentication, you need to balance. So you have to measure your risk appetite and see to which extent you can adapt those legal measures. And you need to get informed decisions. That is, for me, what's the most important. Nobody says that, well, you shall, payments is a highly regulated industry, but it's subject to your risk appetite. So always get informed decisions. There are legal issues, very important to be understood and consumed into your strategies before you develop those strategies. And I'm positive that compliance can bring ROI rather than those strong customer authentication and other kind of mechanisms will disrupt your conversion rates. Thank you very much.